Get out, James barked, his voice cold, eyes dark as a storm. His son, Michael, stood before him, hand in hand with the woman James had told him to leave months ago. She was petite, her caramel skin glowing under the sunlight streaming into the grand living room. Her lips quivered, but she held her ground. Dad, Michael started, but James cut him off. No, you've humiliated this family enough. A black woman, Michael? Really? James spat the words like they were poison. He slammed his hand on the oak desk in front of him. Do you know what people are saying about us? About me? You've dragged our name into the mud. Michael clenched his jaw. His wife, Aisha, gently squeezed his hand. It's not about what people think. It's about love, Dad. Why can't you see that? James scoffed. Love? You're blind. Do you think love pays the bills? Keeps this empire running? She's beneath you, and you know it. Michael took a deep breath, his face unreadable. Then I'll leave, Dad. I'll walk away from the company, the inheritance, everything. Just let us be, for a moment. James looked stunned. Then his face hardened. Fine, go. But don't come back here when the world chews you up and spits you out. You're dead to me. The words hung in the air like a final blow. Aisha's eyes glistened, but she didn't let a tear fall. Michael turned to her, his gaze softening. Let's go, he whispered. Together, they walked out of the mansion, leaving the echoes of James's anger behind. Years passed. James carried on as though his son didn't exist. He told people Michael had moved abroad to find himself, a half-truth that was easier than explaining he had disowned his only child. Business boomed, and the billionaire's name remained untarnished. Yet, in the quiet moments when the house was too silent and the nights too long, James felt the emptiness creeping in. One day, an article caught his eye. It was a feature on a small-town bakery that had gained national fame for its unique flavors and charitable initiatives. The owners were Michael and Aisha Evans. James stared at the screen, his breath catching. The photo showed Michael smiling, flour dusting his hands, with Aisha laughing beside him, holding a tray of pastries. Their son, a little boy with James's eyes, stood between them, grinning. Against his better judgment, James decided to visit. The bakery was nothing like the sterile elegance of his corporate world. It was warm, inviting, with the smell of cinnamon and freshly baked bread wafting through the air. James stood in the doorway, suddenly unsure of himself. Aisha spotted him first. She froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then she turned away, busying herself with a customer. Michael appeared moments later, holding a basket of baguettes. He stopped short when he saw his father. Dad, he said, his tone even. James swallowed hard. Michael, can we talk? Michael nodded and led him to a small table in the corner. They sat in silence for a moment before James spoke. I saw the article. You've done well for yourself. Michael didn't smile. Is that why you're here? To congratulate me? No, James admitted. His voice faltered. I was wrong. About you. About her. I see that now. Michael leaned back, his arms crossed. Do you? Or is it because people are starting to whisper about the great James Sterling's long-lost son? The accusation stung, but James couldn't deny it. Maybe at first, but seeing this place, seeing you, I realized I've missed so much. My grandson. I didn't even know his name. Michael's eyes softened slightly but remained guarded. His name is Elijah. He asks about you sometimes. We tell him his grandfather is a very busy man. James's chest tightened. He looked down at his hands, the calluses long gone, replaced by the smooth skin of a man who hadn't worked with his hands in decades. I've made mistakes, Michael. I let my pride, my prejudice, blind me. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. Michael stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. You don't get to walk back into my life and act like nothing happened. Do you know what it felt like to hear my own father say I was dead to him? To watch you throw me away because of the woman I love? James's throat tightened. I was wrong, he repeated, his voice breaking. I was so wrong. Please, let me make it right. Michael stood, his chair scraping against the floor. It's not that easy. You have to earn your place back in this family, Dad. We're not your charity case. And if you hurt Aisha or Elijah again, you won't see us ever again. Understand? James nodded, his eyes glistening. "I'll do whatever it takes." Michael hesitated, then extended his hand. James took it, holding on like it was the only lifeline he had left. As they stood there, the bakery bustling around them, a small boy peeked out from behind the counter. "Daddy, who's that?" Elijah asked, his voice curious. Michael looked at his son, then at his father. "Elijah, this is your grandpa," he said, his tone soft. For the first time in years, James felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there a chance to rebuild what he had destroyed. James knelt down, his expensive suit wrinkling against the well-worn bakery floor. His eyes, misty with emotion, met the curious gaze of the boy who looked so much like Michael as a child. Elijah tilted his head, studying him with a mix of wonder and shyness. "Hi, Elijah," James said softly, his voice trembling. "I'm your grandpa." Elijah hesitated, looking up at Michael for reassurance. Michael gave a small nod, and Elijah took a tentative step forward. In his small hands, he clutched a cookie, half-eaten, crumbs trailing on his shirt. "Do you like cookies?" the boy asked innocently. James's lips trembled into a weak smile. "I haven't had one in a long time," he admitted, "but I'd love to try one if you'll share." Elijah grinned and broke off a piece, holding it out with sticky fingers. James took it, his hand shaking slightly. The sweetness of the cookie melted in his mouth, but the lump in his throat was harder to swallow. Aisha watched from behind the counter, her expression unreadable. Her heart warred with her memories of James's cutting words and the pain they had caused. Yet, seeing him crouched before Elijah, his polished demeanor stripped away, she wondered if time had softened the man who once seemed impenetrable. "Grandpa, do you like stories?" Elijah asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "I like to tell stories. Daddy says I'm really good at it." James chuckled lightly, brushing at his eyes. "I'd love to hear one of your stories someday, Elijah." The boy's eyes lit up. "Okay, but you have to promise to come back." "Mommy says promises are important." James glanced at Michael, his throat tightening again. "I promise," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael, standing nearby, with his arms crossed, let out a quiet sigh. He wasn't ready to trust his father fully. Years of betrayal couldn't be erased in a single afternoon. But Elijah's innocence and Aisha's silent approval seemed to plant the first seeds of possibility. Over the weeks, James began to visit more often, not as the James Sterling billionaire, but as a man trying to reclaim what he had lost. He would sit at a small corner table in the bakery, watching as Michael worked behind the counter and Aisha managed the books. Elijah would often run up to him with drawings or questions, filling the air with the sound of a child's laughter. James tried to be useful in small ways, stacking chairs, sweeping the floor, even helping Elijah with his school projects. He kept his head down, avoiding the stares of the regulars who whispered about the man who had once cast his family aside. One evening, as the bakery was closing, Michael approached him. "Dad," he said, his tone measured, "why are you doing this? Is it guilt? Regret? Or do you just feel lonely now that you don't have anyone?" James paused, his hands resting on a broom. "It's all of that," he admitted, "but more than anything, I want to fix what I broke. I want to know my grandson. I want to see you happy. I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for another chance." Michael studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "It's going to take time, Dad. A lot of time." "I'll be here," James promised, "for as long as it takes." Months turned into a year. The walls that had once separated James from his family began to crumble. He learned to laugh again, to listen, to see the world through a lens he had spent decades ignoring. He started attending community events, standing beside Aisha and Michael as an equal, not a man clinging to his pride. One summer evening, the family sat on the porch of their modest home, Elijah bouncing on James's knee as fireflies danced in the yard. Aisha brought out lemonade, her smile soft but genuine. Michael leaned back in his chair, watching his father with a mix of guarded hope and quiet acceptance. "Dad," Michael said, breaking the peaceful silence, "do you ever think about what you said back then? About me being dead to you?" James looked down at Elijah, whose tiny hands were wrapped around his grandfather's fingers. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I think about it every day, and I hate myself for it. Michael nodded, his face unreadable. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You were wrong. I was never dead, Dad. I just chose to live without you. The words hung in the air, heavy but truthful. James didn't argue. Instead, he reached over, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. And now? He asked quietly. Michael's eyes softened, his guard lowering just enough. Now, you're learning to live with us. And that's a start. As the stars began to dot the sky, James felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. It wasn't the glow of wealth or power, but the fragile, beautiful glow of a family finding its way back together, one step at a time. As the evening deepened, the porch was filled with the sound of Elijah's giggles and the soft hum of conversation. James leaned back in his chair, the weight of years of regret pressing against him, but there was also a strange, fragile peace in its place. Elijah, still bouncing with energy, clambered onto James's lap and pointed at the sky. Grandpa, look! A shooting star! James followed the boy's finger, watching the streak of light cut across the dark canvas above. Make a wish, Elijah, he said, his voice softer than the breeze. The little boy squeezed his eyes shut, whispering something too quiet to hear. Then he opened them and beamed up at James. Did you make one too, Grandpa? James hesitated, glancing at Michael and Aisha, who were watching him quietly. He nodded. I did. What did you wish for? Elijah asked with wide, innocent eyes. James smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth trembling. I wish to make up for all the time I lost. To be the kind of grandpa and father you can be proud of. Elijah tilted his head. That's a big wish, Grandpa. It is, James said, his voice breaking slightly. But sometimes the biggest wishes are the ones worth making. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the moment. Elijah, it's bedtime, he said gently. Say goodnight to Grandpa. Elijah frowned but obeyed, wrapping his small arms around James's neck. Good night, Grandpa, he whispered. I love you. James froze, the words cutting through the layers of his old self like sunlight through fog. He hugged the boy tightly, his voice trembling. I love you too, Elijah. Aisha took Elijah inside, leaving Michael and James alone on the porch. The night was quiet except for the chirping of crickets and the faint rustling of leaves. Michael leaned back, staring at the sky. You know, he began, his tone contemplative. I never thought I'd see you here, sitting on this porch, holding my son, being part of my life again. James looked down at his hands, which still felt foreign holding a child's. I never thought I'd be here either. I thought I'd die alone in that big house, surrounded by people who only cared about my money. Michael turned to him, his face lit by the dim glow of the porch light. So why did you come back? Was it guilt? Or something more? James sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own confession. It started as guilt. When I saw you in that article, happy and successful without me, it stung. I told myself I came to see if you'd failed without my help. But the truth is, he paused, his voice thick with emotion. The truth is, I missed you, Michael. I missed the son I pushed away. I didn't want to admit it because it meant facing what I'd done. But when I saw you with Aisha and Elijah, I realized what I'd lost, and I couldn't stay away. Michael was silent for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he let out a soft sigh. It's not easy to forgive, Dad, but I'm trying. For Elijah, for Aisha, and maybe for me too. James nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. That's all I can ask for, Michael. Just a chance to earn it. Michael stood, stretching as the cool night air settled around them. One day at a time, Dad. That's all we've got. James nodded again, standing slowly. The ache in his knees reminded him of his age. But tonight, he didn't feel as old. He felt hopeful. As Michael walked inside, James lingered on the porch for a moment longer. He looked up at the stars, the same stars he had ignored for decades, and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time, James Sterling felt like he wasn't walking it alone. The days turned into weeks and the slow, deliberate rhythm of Life in Michael's small town began to chip away at James's hardened edges. He still found it strange and unsettling, even to sit in a bustling bakery instead of a high-rise office. But here, among the scent of fresh bread and the laughter of customers, he started to understand the richness of a life he'd once dismissed as beneath him. One Saturday morning, the bakery was packed. A line of regulars snaked out the door, chatting and laughing as they waited. James, apron tied clumsily around his waist, stood behind the counter. He had offered to help, though it was clear to everyone, including himself, that he was far from a natural. "Grandpa, you're doing it wrong." Elijah giggled from where he sat on a stool, drawing on a scrap of paper. "If you believe in the power of stories to heal, to teach, and to inspire, this is your place. Subscribe now and be part of a community that sees beyond the headlines into the lives that shape them. Together, we'll explore stories that truly matter." The sprinkles go on the cupcakes, not on the floor. James glanced down at the trail of rainbow sprinkles he'd accidentally scattered and chuckled. "Well, I guess I'm not the master baker your dad is," Michael, rolling dough at the other end of the counter, smirked. "You've got that right. But at least you're trying." The words were light, but they carried weight. Trying. It was something James hadn't done in years, not really. For so long, he'd lived in a world where people did the trying for him. Now, every clumsy move, every small effort, felt like progress. Aisha came out from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh croissants. She placed them on the counter and gave James a pointed look. "Don't think you're getting paid for this." James raised his hands in mock surrender. "I wouldn't dream of it." Her lips twitched into a reluctant smile, and she walked away. The small exchange wasn't much, but to James, it felt like a step forward. Aisha's forgiveness was the hardest to earn, and he knew it would take more than time. It would take consistency, showing up, proving himself, over and over. That evening, after the bakery closed, the family gathered around the dinner table. It was a simple meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, but to James, it felt like a feast. Elijah chattered nonstop, recounting his latest adventure at school, while Aisha gently corrected his grammar and Michael listened with an easy smile. "Grandpa," Elijah said suddenly, turning to James, "do you know how to play soccer?" James blinked, caught off guard. "Soccer? Not really." "Why?" Elijah grinned. "Because there's a game tomorrow at the park, and I need a teammate. Daddy's busy fixing stuff, and Mommy says she's not good at sports." Michael chuckled. "He's right. She's terrible." Aisha swatted his arm playfully. "At least I try." James hesitated, then smiled at Elijah. "I'd love to play, but don't expect me to be any good." "That's okay," Elijah said cheerfully. "I'll teach you." The next day, James found himself standing on a patchy soccer field, surrounded by children half his size. He was wearing sneakers that Michael had loaned him and a jersey that hung awkwardly on his frame. Elijah stood beside him, practically bouncing with excitement. "Okay, Grandpa," Elijah said, pointing at the goal. "Your job is to stop the ball from going in there. Got it?" James nodded, though he wasn't entirely confident. The game began, and it was chaos. Children darted around like fireflies, kicking the ball with varying degrees of accuracy. Elijah was a whirlwind of energy, shouting instructions to James as though he were a professional coach. At one point, the ball came hurtling toward James. He lunged for it, his arms outstretched, and missed completely, landing in the grass with a thud. The kids erupted into laughter, and even James couldn't help but chuckle as he sat up, brushing dirt off his knees. "You're not very good, Grandpa," Elijah said, offering him a hand. "No, I'm not," James admitted, taking the boy's hand and standing. "But I'm having fun," Elijah beamed. "That's what matters." Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the park emptied out, Michael approached James. "You didn't do too bad out there," he said, handing him a water bottle. James laughed. "Don't lie. I was awful." "Yeah, you were," Michael said with a grin. "But Elijah had fun. That's what he'll remember." James nodded, his chest tightening. He looked over at Elijah, who was sitting in the grass, showing Aisha a flower he'd picked. "He's a good kid," James said quietly. "You and Aisha, you've built something beautiful here. Michael's expression softened. We have, and we're letting you be a part of it, Dad. Don't forget that. I won't, James promised, his voice thick. I won't. As they walked back to the car, Elijah ran ahead, laughing as Aisha chased him. Michael fell into step beside James, the two of them walking in companionable silence. For the first time in years, James felt like he belonged. It wasn't the life he had envisioned, but it was a life that mattered, a life where love and family came first. And as he watched Elijah's silhouette against the fading light, James knew he would do whatever it took to protect this fragile, beautiful second chance. In the weeks that followed, James found himself becoming a fixture in Michael and Aisha's lives. He no longer felt like a visitor, but someone they could rely on, someone Elijah would excitedly greet at the door, someone Aisha would casually ask to help knead dough in the bakery, someone Michael could share a quiet laugh with during late night cleanup. But James knew that healing wasn't a straight line. The scars he'd left on his family's hearts wouldn't vanish just because he was trying. And one evening, that truth became painfully clear. It was a quiet Sunday night. The bakery had closed early, and the family sat together in the living room. Elijah was sprawled on the rug, building a tower with his wooden blocks, while Michael and Aisha sat on the couch, flipping through a photo album. James sat in an armchair, sipping tea, his eyes wandering the room. Aisha's laughter broke the silence. Oh, look at this one, she said, holding up the album. Michael, do you remember when Elijah tried to bake his first cake? Michael chuckled. How could I forget? He dumped half a bag of flour on the floor and called it snow. Elijah looked up, grinning. I made snow in the summer. The laughter filled the room, warm and genuine. But then Aisha turned a page, and her smile faltered. She stared at a photo for a long moment before closing the album abruptly. Her face was unreadable, but James caught the tension in her shoulders. What's wrong? Michael asked gently. Aisha hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing, just memories. Michael reached for her hand, but she pulled away, standing abruptly. I'm going to check on Elijah's school things for tomorrow, she said, her voice tight. James watched her leave the room, guilt gnawing at him. He didn't need to ask what had triggered her reaction, he already knew. Somewhere in that album was a photo of their wedding, the day James had refused to attend. Michael leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. She doesn't talk about it much, but it still hurts, he said quietly. That day, it was supposed to be one of the happiest of her life. Instead, it's always going to have a shadow. James set his tea down, his hands trembling slightly. I can't take it back, Michael. I wish I could, but I can't. I know, Michael said, his tone weary. But she doesn't need words from you, Dad. She needs actions. Every single day, James nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I'll keep trying. That night, as James prepared to leave, he found Aisha sitting on the porch steps. The cool night air wrapped around them, and the distant sound of crickets filled the silence. She didn't look at him as he approached, but she didn't move away either. I saw the photo, James said softly, sitting beside her. I know it brought back everything. Aisha's jaw tightened. Do you? She said, her voice calm but laced with pain. Do you know what it felt like to marry the man I love, knowing his father hated me so much he wouldn't even show up? James flinched. I didn't hate you, Aisha. You didn't hate me? She interrupted, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. You said I wasn't good enough. You told Michael he was throwing his life away. How is that not hate? James looked down at his hands, the weight of his shame pressing against him. It was ignorance, pride, fear of losing control over Michael's life. I let those things blind me to who you are, to the love you and Michael share. And I will regret that for the rest of my life. Aisha's gaze softened slightly, but her guard didn't drop. Regret doesn't erase what you did, James. It doesn't make it okay. I know, he said quietly, but I'm here now. I'm trying to be the man you and Michael deserve. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you. They sat in silence for a long time, the night stretching around them. Finally, Aisha spoke, her voice softer now. Elijah adores you. He doesn't see the man you were, he sees the man you're trying to be. I see it too. But I need time, James. I need to believe this isn't just temporary. James nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. You'll have all the time you need, Aisha. I'm not going anywhere. Over the month, James continued to show up, not with grand gestures but with the steady, quiet consistency his family needed. He became Elijah's biggest cheerleader at soccer games, Aisha's most eager assistant in the bakery, and Michael's sounding board for life's challenges. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Elijah piped up, "Grandpa, can we have another family picture? One with you in it this time." The room fell silent. Aisha and Michael exchanged a look, then turned to James. He swallowed hard, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I'd like that, Elijah," he said, his voice thick. "I'd like that very much." They gathered in the backyard the next weekend, with Michael setting up a timer on his camera. Aisha stood beside James, and Elijah squeezed between them, holding both their hands. As the camera clicked, capturing their smiles, James felt a warmth he hadn't known in decades. For the first time in his life, he wasn't standing on the outside looking in. He was home. The photograph became more than an image. It became a symbol, a moment frozen in time that spoke of love, forgiveness, and second chances. It hung in the bakery a week later, framed and proudly displayed on the wall behind the counter. Customers who noticed it would smile, often pointing at Elijah's beaming face in the middle. James visited the bakery daily now, not just to help but to be part of the life he once dismissed as insignificant. He found joy in the small things, watching Elijah create masterpieces out of dough, sharing inside jokes with Michael, and hearing Aisha's quiet laughter at his clumsy attempts to fold pastry dough. One afternoon, Elijah ran into the bakery, his face flushed with excitement. "Grandpa, Grandpa," he called, waving a piece of paper in his hand. "Look, I got a gold star in school today." James bent down, taking the paper from Elijah's hand. It was a simple math worksheet, the kind he used to glance at dismissively when Michael was a child. But now, he looked at it as though it were a masterpiece. "A gold star? That's amazing, Elijah. I'm so proud of you. Do you want to put it on the fridge?" Elijah asked, his eyes sparkling. James hesitated. "Your fridge?" he asked, confused. "No, your fridge," Elijah said with a grin. "Daddy said you should have one, so you can put all my gold stars on it." James looked up at Michael, who stood behind the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. Michael met his father's gaze with a small smile and shrugged. "It's about time you made your apartment a little more like home." Home. The word hit James with a wave of emotion. For so long, his penthouse apartment had been a fortress, cold, pristine, and empty. The idea of filling it with reminders of Elijah's small victories, of his family's love, felt like a revelation. That weekend, James returned to the city and made changes he never thought he would. He donated much of the artwork and expensive furniture that once defined his life and replaced them with simpler, warmer pieces. He set up a corkboard in the kitchen where Elijah's drawings and gold star papers would soon hang. When Michael and Aisha visited the following week, Elijah ran from room to room, exclaiming over every little thing. "Look, Mommy! Grandpa has a big chair like ours," he said, pointing to a cozy armchair in the living room. "It's beautiful, James," Aisha said softly, her eyes scanning the space. It was the first time she had called him by his name without hesitation, and the significance wasn't lost on him. "Thanks," James said, his voice steady but full of meaning. "I wanted it to feel more like family." The following months were filled with milestones, each one a testament to the family's growing bond. James attended Elijah's school events, celebrated birthdays at the bakery, and even joined Aisha in organizing a charity drive for the community. One evening, as they gathered in the backyard for a barbecue, Michael raised a glass. "I want to say something," he began, his voice carrying over the hum of the grill and Elijah's laughter as he chased fireflies. James tensed slightly, unsure of what was coming. "When Dad came back into our lives, I wasn't sure it would work," Michael said. "I wasn't sure he could change. But he's proved me wrong, and I'm grateful for that. He's shown Elijah what it means to keep trying, even when it's hard." Michael paused, his gaze locking with James's. "You've earned your place here, Dad. You're not just part of our family, you are family." James's throat tightened as he raised his glass, his voice shaking as he responded. "Thank you, Michael, for giving me this chance, for letting me show you that I can be better. You've given me more than I deserve, and I'll never take it for granted." As they clinked glasses and laughter filled the air, James looked around at the faces he loved. The journey hadn't been easy, and it never would be. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family, he felt something he hadn't in years: complete. He was no longer James Sterling, the billionaire with a legacy to protect. He was James, the father, the grandfather, and the man who had finally learned what truly mattered. If you believe in the power of stories to heal, to teach, and to inspire, this is your place. Subscribe now and be part of a community that sees beyond the headlines into the lives that shape them. Together, we'll explore stories that truly matter.